So kidneys, I believe, are halfway from the head to the toe. So we are probably about there in this series. So my talk was supposed to be on native kidney, and it's quite challenging, actually. This was me 2 nights ago when I realized that I hate my lecture. It covers everything but nothing. I have 135 slides. What am I supposed to do? So I did what I normally do, which is show my presentation to someone else. And here's my friend Tom Lofeld sitting at the workstation, and he reassured me by saying, yes, it's too much information. I agree. He says, only do what sparks joy. Only do what sparks joy. And that reminded me that there's actually a book called Spark Joy. Has anyone read that? Raise of hands, anyone that's read that? Okay. So this has actually been a very interesting book. It's by Marie Kondo. There's now a Netflix series on it, where she basically asks you to go through your stuff in your house and only keep the things that spark joy. So I went through my PowerPoint presentation and destroyed it. There's so much information that's about the kidney that's not in here because it didn't spark joy. So I changed my talk to be Native Kidney Marie Kondo version. So there's going to be a ton of stuff, and I'm already anticipating the questions. How come you didn't cover this? How come you didn't do that? The answer is, it didn't spark joy. That's right. So let's start off. What did I include in there? Well, first of all, there's embryology. How the hell does embryology spark joy? And typically, when people start with embryology, that is a great opportunity to zone out, no longer pay attention until you see the first real image come in, because embryology is not that useful. So please admire that. Did you see that? Okay, that took a long time to do, a lot of YouTube videos to learn how to do that. So if there are any oohs or ahs, that's definitely appreciated. So let's talk about thank you. So let's talk about embryology. Now, I tried to make it interesting so that you wouldn't zone out. So I put little happy faces on different structures to make it more entertaining. So it starts with the mesonephric duct. The mesonephric duct eventually becomes the bladder, among other things. And there becomes a little outpouching of that called the ureteric bud. And that interacts with its friendly friend, the metanephric blastema. Okay? That's how it begins. And these two actually come together and become good friends. They become such good friends that they grow into one another, and they eventually form the major calyces. And you can see the cortex starting to form around the kidney and around the major calyces, and creates this kind of bumpy appearance to the kidney itself that eventually, give it enough time, it fills in and has a nice smooth margin to it. So how is that useful? Who cares about that? Well, it's useful because some people's development arrests at this particular stage, and you end up getting a kidney that looks kind of funky. That's called fetal lobulation. You get those lobulated contours. Now, you can see these a lot of times in preemies, in neonates, and it's just part of their growth pattern, and eventually they will fill in. But sometimes in adults, they don't completely fill in. It's a normal variant. That's embryology 101. Okay, what else can happen? Well, sometimes part of it doesn't fill in, and it's usually between the upper 1/3 and the lower 2/3, and that's referred to as a junctional parenchymal defect. And so sometimes what you'll see is this kind of echogenic wedge-shaped area within the upper to middle 1/3, and sometimes that communicates actually with the renal sinus itself. So that's a junctional parenchymal defect. Nothing to really worry about. This artistic rendition that was incredibly beautifully done by this famous artist actually depicts quite nicely the difference between JPD, junctional parenchymal defect, and scarring. Scarring will be over the medullary portions, or can be over the medullary portions, whereas a junctional parenchymal defect, because it's that lobulation that we're interested in, actually goes between the medullary portions. So that's something to look out for. What else do we have? Well, say there are two outpouchings, two happy little ureteric buds that happen to interact with our blastema. What happens in that case? Well, they get happy, they form a family, And eventually, they grow into two separate major calyces, and eventually, they start forming a kidney that has two separate components. So that's a duplicated collecting system. You can see it depicted here on the ultrasound. You have that cleft between the two renal sinuses that have been created, and you can see the depiction on the CT as well. So that's a duplicated collecting system. That's how it happens. What else can happen? Well, there's normal cortical parenchyma actually goes between the medullary portions of the kidney. And if those are actually called columns of Bertin. And those are normal appearance. Sometimes what happens in development is these things are supposed to regress. They're supposed to become smaller and thinner and whatnot, and sometimes they don't. And so that's referred to as a hypertrophied column of Bertin, which can simulate a mass. And one of the things that we look out for is make sure that it's very similar in echogenicity to the cortex, as you can see here. You can look at the vascularity of it and make sure it doesn't look like a malignant neoplasm. You can do additional imaging you want, but that's a normal finding, so it's something to be aware of. And here's another depiction on CT, and we'll move on. Okay, what else embryologically can happen to a kidney that sparks joy for me? Well, one of the things that can happen is kidneys normally look like this. Sometimes they can be somewhat rotated, and they can mesh together. And what can end up happening is you can have, if they mechanically fuse at the base, you can get a fibrous connection there, and that's mechanical fusion. The other thing that you can actually see in teratogenic fusion is you get these things called the posterior nephrogenic cells that end up migrating to the wrong place, and they can actually end up fusing the two kidneys as a parenchymal isthmus. Now, what's the issue with that? Well, normally the kidneys migrate from their pelvic position early on, and then they migrate up superiorly and go to their normal position. But if they have a connection, whether it's a fibrous or a parenchymal connection, you can see they're going to get hung up at the inferior mesenteric artery. So it's useful because if you don't see the kidneys in the normal location, we have to start thinking, well, they could be elsewhere. Let's take a look elsewhere. Let's try and find them, and they can be in all kinds of locations. So this is an example here of horseshoe kidney, which is typically lower down within the pelvis. So here's an example here. I just moved on, so sorry. Let me go back because this one does spark joy. Let me play that. So pretty. So you can see that fusion here. This is a parenchymal fusion of the kidneys, and you can see its low position. What else can happen if we don't see a kidney in its normal place? Well, you can have renal agenesis, which is what happened in this particular case here. There's no kidney there. We know it's also associated with certain Müllerian abnormalities. In this case here, there was a unicornuate uterus that was associated with it. So there was another case that we saw where we just couldn't find the kidney. We looked everywhere for it, and then eventually we found it fairly high up. And here it is. Here's the right kidney, but you can see it's surrounded by echogenic something or other with dirty shadowing. Where is it? Well, this ended up being all the way in the chest. And I don't know if you can see here, but let me see if I can put this. This is a very responsive mouse. Right here, you can actually see the ureter coming down. This is a thoracic kidney. So sometimes when it's superiorly migrating, it's the diaphragm that will prevent it from going all the way up. But if the diaphragm either doesn't develop or develops late, it can keep on going up into the chest. So here's an example in a peds patient, and here's another example in an adult patient of a thoracic kidney. So really, if we don't see a kidney, we're kind of obligated to look all over from head to toe. Not sure if we have a cranial kidney yet, but if you have a case, I'd love to see it. All right, we're moving on from embryology, ready for the ooze? Ooh, to the parenchymal disease. And guess what? It didn't spark joy. So we move on to cystic disease. And cystic disease sparks way more joy than whether, a kidney is bright or not bright. We all know what we have to look for as far as seeing if the kidney is bright compared to the liver or the spleen. So there was nothing super exciting about that. Stones don't do a whole lot for me. Cystic disease is kind of interesting. So And it's interesting because you get to draw some pretty cool pictures of cystic disease. So here's one here where you see the normal kidney on the left, and on the right is a polycystic kidney. And you can get polycystic kidneys from a number of different processes. So this is a diagram that I drew, which shows autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. And what autosomal dominant polycystic disease, the etiology of it, is really a ciliary issue. The uroepithelium, which is depicted here as a yellow thing, is actually, they have cilia on them. And the cilia actually allows calcium. It has a calcium channel transporter, which has two components, the PKD1 and the PKD2 proteins that allow calcium to enter into the cilia when they're stimulated, and that inhibits growth. So it prevents the urothelium from growing. Now, what happens if one of these two things is knocked out? Well, that prevents calcium from coming in, and it promotes growth of the uroepithelium. So what that functionally ends up doing is it creates these kind of cystic spaces anywhere in the cortex or in the medullary portion. And when you increase the number of these cells, it actually increases the amount of water that comes into that particular component. So you get the proliferation of the cells, which creates cysts, and you also get the increased water transport into the cyst, which causes these things to grow in size. So why does that spark joy? Well, it sparks joy because here's a cyst, and I get to draw it. There's the artery that's feeding the glomerulus on the side, and what happens? It ends up pushing on the artery, and it compresses it, and it ends up leading to areas of ischemia. So as these cysts grow in size, they start impacting the arteries, they lead to areas of ischemia, and eventually large portions of the kidney actually start dying. The other thing the cysts can do is they can bump up against the ureter or against the collecting system and create hydronephrosis. So those are all things that you might see in autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. Here's a nice case, multiple cysts. They end up being quite large. We usually get these to evaluate for renal cell carcinoma, which they do not have an increased likelihood of having, but good luck trying to find an RCC within there. Okay, let's talk autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease as a shout out to the pediatric radiologists. And I'm not a pediatric radiologist, but I think it's a beautiful case. Now, they have an issue as well with the same PKD1, PKD2 gene that causes calcium channel dysfunction. But in the autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease, they tend to occur very early on. They oftentimes see abnormalities within the fetal period. And what this ends up happening is you have tons of tiny little cysts, you have really large kidneys, and this is what it looks like by ultrasound. Very similar to the depiction by the artist on the previous slide. So you end up getting these very tiny little cystic spaces, and when you get tiny little cystic spaces, they can actually appear echogenic, and the echogenicity can either appear because they have little crystalline material within them, or sometimes they're just so small that you're just getting the back wall and it looks bright. You're not seeing the whole cyst. So for those reasons, you can see it that way. Now, I said it's a ciliary issue. The thing that also sparks joy for me is that there's a link between ciliary issues in the kidney and also ciliary issues elsewhere in the body. And that's why oftentimes with autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease and autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease, you can see cysts or issues in other parts. And one of the things you get with autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease is you can actually get issues related to the bile ducts. Bile ducts have cilia as well. The cilia is abnormal in those patients, and they can actually get abnormally dilated bile ducts within the kidney, and you can get a central dot sign, and that would end up being Caroli's disease. So that's a nice depiction here of a patient who had autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease. On top of that, they also had Caroli's disease. So they go hand in hand with each other. Sparks joy. Okay, acquired cystic disease, we'll move on from that. Basically, you're on dialysis, you can get cysts. It can look like autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, but it's not typically a dilemma because usually people know why they've had some kind of renal dysfunction to lead to dialysis. So syndromic cysts, I had to put a little arrow in here because I'm not a neuroradiologist and I've completely forgotten neuroradiology. So these are cortical tubers, I'm told, that you can see. And in these particular patients, they can also get cysts, they can get multiple angiomyolipomas, and this patient is predominantly angiomyolipomas, but you can also see cysts within patients with tuberous sclerosis. Von Hippel-Lindau, again, similar thing. You can see multiple cysts within the pancreas as well as within the kidney itself. Von Hippel-Lindau can also be associated with renal cell carcinoma, so when we scan the kidneys, we have to be careful. This was a particular case where the ultrasound was called negative, and then they ended up doing a CT, and we were embarrassed by finding multiple renal cell carcinomas within the kidney itself. So it's a very challenging thing to do by ultrasound. Okay, what about this one? This is another case where we saw a cyst, called a cyst, very nice, but actually there's enhancing parenchyma around it. This is actually a cystic renal cell carcinoma, and if you go back to the ultrasound, you can see that, sure enough, that was a renal cell. So they can be challenging. Moving back to our embryology, we have our happy ureteric bud with a metanephric blastoma. We know that these come together and form a nice kidney. What happens if the ureteric bud looks ugly like this? You see the sad face? That is an ugly ureteric bud. So not all fusion goes well together. So when these come together, it's not a happy marriage. And what this can end up doing is sometimes when you get issues with the ureteric bud, it can create small little cysts in the medullary portion. And those cysts can have stones, they can become infected, and they end up looking like this, where they have cysts, they can be echogenic. This is a medullary sponge kidney, so that's the pathophysiology behind medullary sponge kidney, and you can see because of the multiple cysts with little stones in them and whatnot, it will make the medullary portions of the kidney look brighter. You can also see that in renal tubular acidosis, you can see it in hypercalcemic states, so there's a differential for this, but the medullary sponge kidney pathogenesis sparked joy within me. Okay, this is another one that sparks joy. Again, multiple small cysts. Some of them look echogenic either because they have crystalline material or you're just getting the back wall. You can see it bilaterally. This is a patient who is actually on lithium. So this is lithium toxicity, another cause of multiple little cysts that I enjoyed. Okay, moving on to solid disease. Solid disease is really interesting because you can have two main forms of solid disease within the kidney. You can have the expansile form, which we're all used to. There's also the infiltrative pattern, which is the very challenging one. And most of the misses that I found were the infiltrative type of tumor. So I like to show histology because nobody in the audience will know what they're looking at probably, and I don't know what I'm looking at either, but I can make it up, and it makes me sound like I know what I'm saying. So here is an expansile form. This is clear cell renal cell carcinoma that's going up against normal parenchyma on this side, and it creates this pseudocapsule. It's a fibrous reaction to the tumor itself, so it delineates the tumor really well. In this particular case, this is the collecting duct right here, and you can see around it are malignant cells, so this is more of an infiltrative pattern on histology. Now, we know that with expansile forms, you got RCC, AML, oncocytoma, lymphoma, transitional cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, metastatic disease can all look like expansile. Well, most of these can actually look infiltrative. And the most common infiltrative tumor is actually renal cell carcinoma, just because renal cell carcinoma is such a common tumor to begin with. So the most common infiltrative tumor is actually renal cell carcinoma, even though TCC, squamous cell carcinoma, and leukemia tend to be more infiltrative just because it's so overwhelmingly common to have renal cell carcinoma that ends up being the most likely infiltrative tumor within the kidney. Let's look at some examples of expansile masses. Okay, here's one here. Expansile mass, inferior pole. Hopefully no one would miss that. This one ended up getting a CT, and this was a clear cell carcinoma. They tend to be avidly enhancing. You can see that in contrast-enhanced ultrasound as well. Here's another one here where you can see this expansile mass within the kidney, difficult to miss. And we ended up looking at it for vascularity, couldn't see a whole lot of vascularity within it. We did contrast-enhanced ultrasound, and you can see the vascularity quite nicely. Here, you can see on the arterial phase, it's going in there, it lights up brightly. This is our arterially enhancing mass that ends up washing out when you look a little later. This ended up being a papillary renal cell carcinoma. This is a really nice example. This image sparks joy. Probably of all the images I have, this one is a beautiful image because this is an oncocytoma. Oncocytomas are supposed to have a stellate scar. This one has a stellate scar. I'm seeing some head nods. Thank you. I appreciate that. This is a beautiful image. It took me hours upon hours to find such an example in our PAC system, but I found this. I hope this sparks joy in you too. Okay, what else can you have? Well, let's take a look here. This is a tough one. This one, you have to look down here in the kidney. There's an echogenic mass here that's quite well hidden that ends up being an angiomyolipoma because of its fat content can appear bright. Here's another lesion right here. It looks isochoric to the cortex. It has some areas of echogenicity within it. This one ended up being a lipid-poor angiomyolipoma. It was only diagnosed after it was excised. Other expansile masses, see this one? What do you think this one is? Here's the color Doppler. We go through it. This one ends up being an abscess. So not everything that's expansile is a tumor. Think about abscesses as well. Here's another one. I wouldn't show two abscesses. Well, I did. This is a second abscess. So they can look very convincingly solid, but this one ends up being an abscess. Okay, infiltrative masses. Got a couple minutes. This is the one that's really interesting here. So here's a nice infiltrative mass. It still keeps its reniform shape. It might look expanded, but this is a renal cell carcinoma that infiltrated into the kidney, went into the renal vein and up the IVC. And here's how it looks on CT. You can see it keeps that reniform shape, but it infiltrates within the kidney. Here's another one here. This is the kidney 3 months prior to this one. You can see this large mass expanding the inferior pole. By the time we found it on ultrasound, it was already spread everywhere. This was a medullary carcinoma in a younger patient. Here's a nice infiltrative mass. Looks very odd, but it's infiltrative lymphoma. And here you can see the infiltrative pattern. Lymphoma is one of those that can look like a solid mass, but it can also look like an infiltrative mass as well. So there's quite a bit of overlap. Here's one here that I would have just called slightly echogenic. I would have probably suggested some kind of cortical parenchymal abnormality, medical renal disease, as it was formerly called. This ends up being leukemia. So this is a tough one because it's not as expansive as some of the other masses, but this ended up being leukemic infiltration of the kidneys. Here's another one. Look at this one. This is one that from last week, actually, at our institution. It was raised that there was something that looks odd about this kidney, but the report I should have included in here was quite funny. It was a very hedgy report. So they ended up getting a CT on this patient, and this is a patient who had very infiltrative transitional cell carcinoma, much more stark on the CT than the ultrasound. So it's something that when we start seeing things that look odd diffusely within the kidney, we have to think of infiltrative masses. Here's another example of an infiltrative mass in the superior pole of the kidney. This person ended up having pyelonephritis. So you can see the echogenic debris within the bladder, which is associated with urinary tract infections. This patient had pyelonephritis, which can look like an infiltrative pattern. Here's, I think, a final case. Again, infiltrative pattern, you still have that reniform appearance. Centrally, there's something echogenic with shadowing. This ends up being why am I blanking on the name? Anyone? Yes, XGP, xanthogranulomatosis pyelonephritis. Wow. Anyone got coffee? All right. So that's it. That's a little tour through what excites me. Yeah. I didn't bring my kids with me, so I was looking at things last night, and Yeah, I kind of miss them now, even though I was excited to leave. But anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.